Good morning, friends. I am Sachin Ketkar from the MS University of Baroda, and I have with me Ms. Pankti Desai from Udna College, and we are going to talk about Tagore's Gitanjali. As you know, Tagore's Gitanjali is a very famous work, and you might have studied Tagore in various places in your school as well as in your college curriculum. So let's have a discussion on Tagore's Gitanjali. Basically, we are going to do three things in this discussion. We are going to look at Tagore's life in very brief and the background to his life. We are going to look at background to Gitanjali in particular, and then we are going to offer a kind of stylistic and thematic analysis of some of his well-known poems. So, and we are planning in such a way that the students will understand the relationship between text and its context. The whole idea of this discussion is to consider Tagore as a representative poet of his period, that is 19th century, the colonial period. So let's look at some of the slides that we have brought up. Shall we, Pankti?
Yes. Rabindranath Tagore, also known as Rabindranath Thakur, born on 7th May 1861 and died on 7th August 1941. Gurudev Tagore was a Bengali poet, novelist, musician, painter and playwright.
So what we can see, Pankti, is how versatile he was, and he belonged to a period called Bengal Renaissance. And the one chief characteristic of Renaissance period is that it gave rise to many stalwarts who were versatile in many areas, and that's why they were called Renaissance men. So Tagore is typically Renaissance man.
Yeah, that is why Tagore has tremendous influence on Bengali literature, culture and Indian literature. And he is the only person, only non-European to win Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913.
Right. And he was also knighted by the British Crown. He was given the title Sir in 1915. And out of his love for his country and against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which he protested, he returned the title to Britishers, which shows his love for nation and his nationalism. Let's have a look at the next slide.
Yes. He is the only writer who has written anthems of two countries, India, the Jana Gana Man, and Bangladesh, Amar Sonar Bangla. He is the founder of Shanti Niketan, the Vishwa Bharati University, and he was also a proponent of Indian independence.
As we know, Shanti Niketan is a very important university in India, and it is based on the philosophy of Rabindranath Tagore, the educationist. So he is not just a writer, painter, musician, playwright and a novelist, but he is a very great educationist, and Vishwa Bharati University embodies his ideals.
And Dr. Ketkar, isn't it that between 1878 and 1932, Tagore travelled to more than 30 countries, befriending eminent literary figures like Yeats, Ezra Pound, Robert Frost, Thomas Mann and H.G. Wells. He also met with Albert Einstein and Mussolini.
Right, he has travelled widely, and we can see that he knew many of great people of his period personally, like Einstein and Mussolini, and very great writers like Yeats, Pound, Robert Frost and Thomas Mann. So he is a very well recognized figure outside India even before 1932.
And look what he has written. He is a composer of 3,000 poems, 2,000 songs and 40 volumes of essays, 50 plays, 8 novellas and 4 novels.
You can see how prolific a writer he was.
Yes.
3,000 plus poems, 2,000 plus songs, 40 books of essays, 50 plays, 8 novels and 4 novellas.
And prominent among them are?
Prominent among his novellas are novellas like Gaire Bahire and Choker Bali. You might have heard of Choker Bali because it's recently made into a film.
Yes. It was directed by Rituparna Ghosh in 2003 and stars Prasenjit as Mahendra, Aishwarya Rai as Binodini and Raima Sen as Ashalata.
Yes, and Satyajit Ray made many of his works into films. So he has been widely filmed.
Yes, and Rabindra Sangeet. Let us talk about Rabindra Sangeet too.
Right.
He was an accomplished musician. He composed more than 2000 songs which constitute a distinctive style of music, Rabindra Sangeet, which is known as Rabindra Sangeet. They are part of his novels and stories and have been used in Bengali movies as well as in Hindi movies also.
Right.
The collection of his songs is known as Gita Bitan, Garden of Songs. The Rabindra Sangeet has influenced the styles of such musicians as Sitar Maestro Vilayat Khan and the Sarodiyas Buddhadev Desgupta and Amjad Ali Khan. Even why don't you talk about the film Parinita and its music?
Right. Parinita is a very famous film that many of you might have seen, and it contains a song called Piyu Bole, and this song is actually based on the tune of a poem called
Bole Bole.
Yeah, Fule Fule Dole Dole in Bengali.
Yes.
And S.D. Burman's very famous composition Tere Mere Milan Ki Ye Rehna, picture is on Amitabh Bachchan, if you remember.
Yes.
And Jaya Bhaduri in the film Abhiman is based on Tagore's very famous song called Jodi Tare Nai Chini Go Sheki.
Tagore was also a painter, you know that, na?
Right.
At the age of 60, Tagore took up drawing and painting. He was a prolific painter and had several exhibitions around the world. He was said to suffer from color blindness as he painted with certain peculiarities in color schemes and aesthetics.
What is interesting about Tagore, that as a painter he is also widely recognized, and at the age of 60 he starts painting, and his genius as a painter emerges very late in his life. So you can see the versatility of this man. And we are discussing all these things because Gitanjali, the songs which we are going to discuss, have a distinctive influence of Rabindra Sangeet, and they are usually sung to the tunes of Rabindra Sangeet. And Tagore as a painter also is what we can see in his poems, which are full of very vivid imagery, colorful imagery, and we will look at them when we are looking at the poems in particular.
Yes. Tagore was influenced by Vedantic spiritualism, the Bhakti poetry, poetry of bowls, and Western literature. Let us talk something. Why don't you discuss something about the influences Tagore had?
Yeah, Tagore is typically a 19th century intellectual where he is trying to reconcile the native traditions of philosophy and thought with the Western ones. So you can see in Tagore a kind of union of Western philosophy and Eastern thought, and this union is very fruitful. One of very important influences on his work is the native philosophical tradition of Vedanta, and Upanishads were a great influence on him. Upanishadic philosophy in particular, which teaches the doctrine of Advaita in particular, seems to be have left its deep imprint on Tagore's mind. Plus, Tagore was also a Brahmo Samajist. His own father, Debendranath Tagore, was one of the founders of Brahmo Samaj. Friends, you might have heard of Brahmo Samaj in your school, right? And Brahmo Samaj was founded by Rajaram Mohan Roy and his friend later on, Debendranath Tagore, who is also father of Rabindranath Tagore. And one of the basic teachings of Brahmo Samaj is that there is only one God, and the outlook of Brahmo Samaj is Vedantic. They don't believe in rituals. It was a kind of reformist religion. So this is very important influence on Tagore's philosophy.
And the other influence on him is that is of the Bhakti poetry, the poetry of bowls, and Western literature. Will you please throw some light on the Bhakti poetry and poetry of bowls?
Friends, you are familiar with the term Bhakti, right? And Bhakti stands for loving devotion as a spiritual practice which leads to attainment of divine, oneness with divine. So it's a mystical practice. But Bhakti movement was a spiritual and social reformist movement of 9th and 10th century in India, which spread all over the subcontinent. And it gave rise to great poetry, and you might have heard of names like Kabir, you might have heard of Tukaram, you might have heard of Narsi Mehta, and such great composers were Bhakti poets. And this is a very powerful tradition of poetry which Rabindranath himself seems to have actually adopted. He owns that legacy of bhakti poetry, and that's very clearly seen in Gitanjali, which means devotional compositions, right? Songs of offering, songs which offer yourself to God. So Gitanjali is essentially a bhakti composition.
And there is a poetry of bawls which also influenced Tagore.
Right. Bawls are actually it's a kind of sect in Bengal, and very similar to minstrels and singers, but they are also spiritual practitioners, and they have a distinctive tradition of music and very powerful social protest and kind of strange assertiveness that you can see in their poetry. And Tagore was such deeply influenced by bawls that Gitanjali bears great imprint of bawl music and bawl poetry. So these are three very important influences on his work.
And the fourth is the Western literature, right?
Yeah. As I said, that Tagore is a kind of union of both Western as well as Indian traditions, and in Western tradition you can clearly see the influence of English Romantic movement.
Yes.
And friends, you might have heard of poets like Keats, Shelley, Byron, Blake, and
the nature, influence of nature.
And that is very distinctively seen in Gitanjali, which actually sees nature as embodiment of divine, which is a very romantic idea. So bhakti as well as English Romantic poetry is what we can see.
Yes.
But Pankti, apart from romantic poetry, you can also see influence of Bible.
Yes.
On Tagore's translations of Gitanjali, and if you have studied a poem or two from Gitanjali, friends, then you might be looking at the words like thou and thine coming often. So it's distinct kind of archaism which is very biblical in nature. And there is something like Songs of Solomon in Bible, which seems to have influenced Tagore's distinctive style. So Songs of Songs or Songs of Solomon are also
influence. Bible has also influence.
Tagore's
that is what you mean to say, right?
Of, Songs of Solomon.
And I think while discussing poetry, we'll talk about Bible and all the influence. We have taken some of the poems.
Right.
And now, shall we talk about what the eminent major poets they have to say about Tagore? Let's look at the slide. What Ezra Pound has said about Tagore. There is in him, quote, there is in him the stillness of nature. The poems do not seem to have been produced by storm or by ignition, but seem to show the normal habit of his mind. He is at one with nature and finds no contradictions. And this is in sharp contrast with the Western mode, where man must be shown attempting to master nature if we are to have great drama. Unquote. It is by Ezra Pound. He wrote in Fortnightly Review, 1st March 1913. I think soon after the publication of Gitanjali's translation, right? And Nobel
Very
Prize.
Interesting thing to note here, Pankti, is that how Ezra Pound differentiates between Western mode of thinking and philosophizing with the Eastern. In the West, Ezra Pound says that there is a tendency to dominate and master nature.
Right.
While in Eastern thought, there is no such tendency to master or control and dominate nature, but there is a tendency to be one with nature.
Assimilation.
Right. There is some sort of union with nature, and Ezra Pound has very rightly detected this outlook, which is very Indian in Gitanjali.
Right.
Let's look what other very famous
W.B.
poet
Yeats, who wrote the preface.
Yeah.
And the preface, what he says, let's look at the slide. W.B. Yeats, while writing the preface of the Gitanjali translation, he said, quote, the work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. A tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphors and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and of the noble. a whole people, a whole civilization, immeasurably strange to us, seems to have been taken up into this imagination, and yet we are not moved because of its strangeness, but because we have met our own image. Unquote. W.B. Yeats, Preface to Gitanjali.
These two observations are very interesting, Pankti, because if you look at it, both of these observations seem to be saying same thing, that the Easterners do not have the tendency to dominate nature. At the same time, there is some sort of unity and union with nature, and the Westerners also notice this strangeness. Now, in today's time, when we talk of post-colonial theory, this kind of representation or looking at India in a particular way might be seen as a problematic one, given the fact that this was in fact a kind of stereotype which Orientalist discourse constructed about India. So today's theorists and critics would like to problematize Yeats and Ezra Pound's views on Tagore as Orientalist in nature. So this is a very important fact to be kept in mind when we look at Western critics reading Gitanjali,
very
especially
true.
Of the earlier
Very
times.
true. Shall we directly now move to the Gitanjali and its analysis? Let's look at the slide. Gitanjali, it's a song offerings. Subtitle is a collection of prose translations made by the author from the original Bengali with an introduction by W.B. Yeats. First, we'll give little bit introduction regarding the text, right? It is a collection of 103 poems. It is largely translated by Rabindranath Tagore himself. It is that the translations were undertaken prior to a visit to England in 1912, where the poems were extremely well received, isn't it?
Yeah. Very interesting thing is that Tagore was a very famous name before he became famous in 1912, and Bengalis living in England were actually swearing by him, and they were actually adoring him. But people like Yeats had no idea why he is being praised. Right. So for the first time actually they get to see who this man is when he brings his own translations along in 1912 visit. So let's look further at this.
Let's look at the slide. Gitanjali is a slender volume. It was published in 1913 with a preface by W.B. Yeats, a major poet, 20th century major poet, and in the same year, based on a corpus of translations, Rabindranath became the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize. Correct?
Yeah, that's very interesting. He is the first non-European to win Nobel Prize, and people like Yeats and not Ezra Pound, but Yeats had already won Nobel Prize. So he is a very important name in the history of world literature also, because he is the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize.
Correct. Let's look at the other slide.
Yeah.
Gitanjali in Bengali is also the title of an earlier Bengali volume published in 1910 of 157 mostly devotional songs. The word Gitanjali is composed from the word Git, means song, and word Anjali means offering, and thus means and collect an offering of songs. The word for offering Anjali has a strong devotional connotation, so the title may also be interpreted as prayer offering of song. The English collection is not a translation of poem from Bengali volume of the same name. Correct, na?
Yeah. So it's not a translation of the entire book, but what Tagore has done, as we'll look in the next slide, what Tagore has really done, that he has selected only half of the song from the Bengali collection called Gitanjali. He has taken 52 out of 103 songs, and other songs are taken from his other collection like Giti Mallo in 1914, Nobedyo in 1901, Khia, and some other works. So it's a kind of selection from many other collections. So though its name is Gitanjali, it's not a direct translation of the text by the same name. So that is what I think we should bear in mind when we look at Gitanjali as a translation of Bengali poems.
Correct. The translations were often radical, leaving out or altering large chunks of the poem, and in one instance even fusing two separate poems, Song 95, which unifies Song 89 and 90 of Naivedya. I think many a times he has done such things.
Yes. So his own translations, Pankti, are not faithful renderings of his originals. Being the poet himself, his translation, he has taken a lot of liberties to alter, change, modify, fuse two poems into one. Now this is a very strange thing to do, because we might get an impression that he is actually giving a faithful rendering of his Bengali works, but he is not. So what he is doing is he is transcreating, or he is giving a creative rewriting of his own works rather than producing a faithful literal translation.
Correct. So many poets have done such things.
Yes.
Right. Let us look at the other slide. I think now we'll directly deal with the analysis of poems.
Yeah.
What I will do, I will first read out the poem and you will provide the analysis of the particular poem.
Fine.
Correct?
Yeah.
So
but before we look into poem, we can also just summarize what we have done. So students who are paying attention, what we have done is we have given a background to Tagore's life. We have seen him as a poet who is representative of colonial period, where Indian and native traditions, creative and intellectual, come together in one man. In his own genius, creative genius, there is a fusion of two kinds of intellectual traditions, and he is a typical 19th century poet who has had great influence on all poetry of India. Then we have also seen background to his works and his life. We have seen how he was a painter and a musician of high order. He was an educationist. So we have to bear this in mind, that he was a painter and a musician, because Gitanjali is both music and it's also painting.
Correct. Let us look at the slide and some of his poems. First we'll take poem number 72, which deals with the theme of God as lover and God living within. Dr. Ketkar, I'll read out the poem, right? Life of my life, I shall ever try to keep my body pure, knowing that thy living touch is upon all my limbs. I shall ever try to keep all untruths out from my thoughts, knowing that thou art that truth which has kindled the light of reason in my mind. Okay. I shall ever try to drive all evils away from my heart and keep my love in flower, knowing that thou hast thy seat in the innermost shrine of my heart. And it shall be my endeavor to reveal thee in my action, knowing it is thy power gives me strength to act.
It's a very philosophical and it's a devotional poem. If you look at it, he is addressing divine, the God, as somebody who resides in your heart, somebody who is not outside, right? So he is calling him life of my life. At the same time, he is calling God as somebody who lives within his heart, as antaryami, as we say, and how it's duty of the poet to reveal the divine through his activity. So poetry becomes a kind of devotional activity. So devotion and creative writing are not seen as something two distinct activities, right? It's kind of duty of a poet to reveal God in his activity, right? So that's a very profound comment which he makes.
Let us look at another poem. Poem number 69, the theme of oneness with nature and nature as embodiment of divine. Influence of, mostly you will see the influence of English Romanticism on this poem.
Right. So you can see how English Romanticism and native Bhakti traditions come together in same kind of same spirit and same expression. So it seems like it's a hybrid kind of sensibility, but at the same time you can see that they are not so incompatible. They are very close in their spirit to each other. So let's read this poem. Okay. It's a very interesting one.
Yes, let's look at the slide. The same stream of life that runs through my veins, night and day, runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measures. It is the same life that shoots in joy through the dust of the earth and numberless blades of grass, and breaks into tumultuous waves of leaves and flowers. It is the same life that is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and of death, in ebb and in flow. I feel my limbs are made glorious by the touch of this world of life, and my pride is from the life throb of ages dancing in my blood this moment.
He compares, he expresses union with his self and nature. The blood which is flowing through his veins, Pankti, is also the same life force which is flowing through trees, through leaves, through grass, through everywhere in nature. So he says that the both spirit of nature and spirit of human being, the self, is one in this poem. So this is an expression of Advaita at the level of the world, right? For Tagore, Advaita doesn't mean rejection of world or rejection of nature or rejection of life. In fact, it's Advaita which is inside of life. It is never life rejecting. In fact, it is life affirming. That's
and at the same time, when he has translated, most the translations are prosaic, whereas the romantic poems were quite lyrical, and must be his original Bengali poems must be. It is quite lyrical, right?
Yeah,
because most
they are
of
songs.
the
They are
songs.
songs to
But
tune.
when it is translated, it is mostly prosaic.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment to make, Pankti. These are songs and he has translated them into free words, and the style of free verse resembles free words of Bible and even Walt Whitman at times, whom we talked about in our previous lecture. Walt Whitman kind of free words which is flowing and going on to the length, talking about oneness with nature. So you can find Walt Whitman's sensibility and Tagore's sensibility. More or less they were contemporaries probably.
Right.
Tagore came slightly late, but at the same time they are similar in spite of living in very different cultures in America and in India.
Correct. Now let us look at another poem.
Yeah.
Let us look at the slide. Poem number 7. Theme of creativity as Bhakti and God as master creator. My song has put off her adornments. She has no pride of dress and decoration. Ornaments would mar our union. They would come between thee and me. Their jingling would drown thy whispers. My poet's vanity dies in shame before thy sight. O master poet, I have sat down at thy feet. Only let me make my life simple and straight, like a flute of reed for thee to fill with music.
It's a very beautiful song which expresses a kind of metaphor between, a kind of analogy between song and a lover going to meet his beloved, and it's also a comparison of soul going to meet the divine. So it's a kind of allegory, but the song is an expression of Tagore's creativity.
Correct.
So creativity, human soul, and lover meeting her beloved, all three come together in expression of a single poem. So it's a very allegorical and metaphorical expression. And if you look at the poem closely, then he says that his poems, his poetry, his songs has no pride in dress or decorations, and he has actually kept all his ornaments aside. He has kept all the ornaments, alankar as we say, and alankar as figure of speech, the artifice of poetry. So he says that I am abandoning artifice of my poetry, making my poems natural so that they come to you as your devotees without any show, right? And so it becomes an act of humility, and that's why the title of the collection, Gitanjali, it's an act of humility. It's offering. The songs are offered to the divine, and songs are again compared to lover going to meet the divine. So it's very interesting to look at this comparison, and it reminds us of songs of songs or songs of Solomon on one hand. It also reminds us of Jayadev's Geet Govind, which is again a kind of devotional and erotic love for the divine. So eroticism, love and creativity seems to come together in this poem. So it's a very interesting poem.
Right. Shall we look at the next poem?
Yeah.
Right. Let us look at the slide. Poem number 8. Theme of freedom from material bondage. The child who is decked with prince's robes and who has jeweled chains round his neck loses all pleasure in his play. His dress hampers him at every step. In fear that it may be frayed or stained with dust, he keeps himself from the world and is afraid even to move. Mother, it is no gain, thy bondage of finery, if it keeps one shut off from the healthful dust of the earth, if it rob one of the right of entrance to the great fair of common human life.
Interesting thing about this poem, it combines Tagore's view of bhakti and devotion, which is different from, say, for example, spiritual or other practices which ask us to leave life behind, right? To live as tyag, right? To live, to give up in renunciation. For Tagore, bhakti is not renunciation, right? But at the same time, he sees that these material things, these clothes that people have to wear, this finery which he is addressing as a child to mother, and the image here is no longer that of a lover and beloved, but child and mother. And you can see that it's the image of child and mother becomes another figure of speech for relationship between divine and the devotee. And poet seems to be saying here that the material things are actually discomfort. They come between natural life and you. So wealth and material things are no longer seen as evil, but at the same time they are seen as something that comes between the life and the
love
and the poet. So it seems to be something, he compares this material wealth with child who is decked with princess robe. So princess robes are very heavy, expensive, and child is always conscious of it, trying to see that it doesn't get stained or torn. And so these princess robes actually does no good for the child who wants to go out and play in earth. So this is the comparison between material wealth, devotee, and God, this kind of relationship that it comes out. So again, very interesting thing about this is he is addressing mother, and Kali is a very important deity in Bengal. So the songs addressed to mother also have a special significance in Tagore's poetry. It means your mother is something that is which many Bengalis could identify themselves with. Yeah. The whole idea of mother and son.
Correct. Now let us look at the
next
poem, that is Theme of Freedom from Ego. Poem number 29. He whom I enclose with my name is weeping in this dungeon. I am ever busy building this wall all around, and as this wall goes up into the sky day by day, I lost sight of my true being in its dark shadow. I take pride in this great wall, and I plaster it with dust and sand, lest a least hole should be left in this name, and for all the care I take, I lost sight of my true being. Yes.
This is a very philosophical poem again. It expresses the idea that ego, the human identity, and human being are two different things. The being of a true being and identity actually seem to be at loggerheads here, in the sense that it locks off true being into a narrow walls. And who is responsible for creating walls around us is our ego.
Yes.
So we wall ourselves in the ego, and what happens that our true being remains in the shadow of that ego. Right. So there is a great suffocation and suffering, misery which takes place because of the ego. And what I want to talk about is the theme of freedom also is a very important theme in Gitanjali. Freedom from material bondage, freedom from ego, which is the freedom of all freedoms, right? And freedom, as we will see in other poems, freedom for the nation also. So freedom, love, devotion, these are important themes in Gitanjali.
Correct.
So let's look at the imagery here. Yeah.
Yes.
That he imagines that because of ego he is in dungeon. He is in the darkness, the dark shadow. Right. And he has it. And he takes great pride in the dungeon.
Right.
But he doesn't know what cost he is paying for that.
But at the same time he has made that, at the same time he is weeping too. So he's not happy after creating that wall and everything.
Right.
Though he is taking pride.
Right. And he says that I plaster it with dust and sand, lest the least hole should be left in his name. Right. So even a small hole he doesn't want to see, but at the same time he is actually trapped. So
Correct.
ego is a very terrible thing. It locks the true being. At the same time, it keeps divine away from you.
Correct.
So freedom from ego is probably freedom from the freedom of freedom of all times.
Shall we look at the theme of love for nation and freedom from slavery of all kinds?
Yes.
Poem number 35. I think this is a very famous poem, and whenever I read, I feel that I have read it.
Yeah, it's a very famous poem, and
Right.
it's sung in many schools. It's on the walls of many schools.
True,
Pankti,
true,
and
that is
it's
right.
often prescribed in many textbooks. So this is very famous poem and very interesting one. It is also about theme of freedom and love, but freedom and love for your country. So
Okay.
this is a prayer to God, and it expresses Tagore's vision of how nation should be instead of what
Let
it
me
is.
once read the
Yeah, let's look
entire
at
poem. Yes, let's look at the slide. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arm towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habits, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake.
Yeah, this is a very important poem. So let's keep it on the slide so that our students
Yes,
can
yes,
read it,
yes,
and
yes.
we'll discuss it in bit detail because this is a prescribed poem in many textbooks.
Very
so
true.
let's look at the slide, and we'll discuss this poem here.
Yes.
And if you look at this poem again, it's strangely father-son kind of relationship coming here, right? So he is addressing God in many forms, as
Correct.
lover, as mother, now as father.
Father.
And because he is talking of his motherland, he is addressing God as father.
Father, correct.
Right? And if you look at the poem, it expresses the theme of how he imagines his nation to be. Right? It expresses his utopia here, and it is in contrast to what his nation really is when he is living. So let's look at the first line of the poem in the slide,
Where
he
the
says,
mind is without fear
"Fear
and the head is held high.
Where knowledge is free, he is imagining his country would be where a person can live with head held high without fear, where knowledge doesn't come with a price tag, right? Where world is not broken up into fragments by domestic walls. It's a one world. And very important thing to be kept in mind when we think of Tagore's love for nation or nationalism is that nationalism is not narrow-minded one.
Right.
For him, the whole world is nation, right?
Correct.
And that's why he often came in conflict with nationalist movements of his time, who considered British to be their enemies and evil. While Tagore is in favor of whole world as nation. So he believes that whole world is one, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, whole world as a family.
Did he actively participate in the freedom?
Right, he did
Movement?
participate by giving up things like his title of Sir, knighthood.
Yeah.
And in response to Jallianwala Bagh. But at the same time, he also had very great differences with Gandhiji.
True, that is what I want to emphasize. Yeah.
And Gandhiji believed in rejection of Western culture and society, while Tagore believed that Western society and culture have certain place in Indian culture. You
Correct.
can't just outright reject them. So
Correct.
his vision of nation is not closed, but it's very open. And his open-mindedness is what we should keep in mind when we read this. Let's look at the poem, other lines. Let's look at the slide here.
Yes.
Right? He is talking of world which is not broken up into
Words.
fragments by narrow domestic walls. Then he says words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where clear stream of reason has not lost its way into dreary desert sand of dead habit. If you look at the imagery and metaphors here, dreary desert sand of dead habit. Habitual life is a mechanical life, and what happens in this mechanical kind of life is that reasoning loses its place in our life.
Correct.
So this mechanical thinking is what he is he is seeing as a danger, and he prays to God, telling him that please save our country from mechanical thinking.
Right. Shall we go to move to?
Let's look at a few other lines. I'm discussing this poem in detail because
so
it's widely taught in schools and colleges. The last couple of lines, where mind is led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. So again, theme of freedom coming up in different form.
Correct.
It's not freedom from ego here, but it's freedom from slavery and bondage.
All kind of.
Again, egoistical thinking, which seems to have caught this nation in its grip.
Right.
It's a very important poem, and that's why I discuss in detail. Now let's look at one more poem before we close. And this poem we are discussing because this brings up another very important theme in Gitanjali, and that
the theme of death.
Now let's look how Tagore looks at death.
Death, thy servant is at my door. He has crossed the unknown sea and brought thy call to my home. The night is dark and my heart is fearful. Yet I will take up the lamp, open my gates, and bow to him my welcome. It is thy messenger who stands at my door. I will worship him, placing at his feet the treasure of my heart. He will go back with his errand done, leaving a dark shadow on my mourning, and in my desolate home only my forlorn self will remain as my last offering to thee.
It's a very profound poem where he is comparing death to messenger of God. At the same time, he is calling him his servant. He is a herald sent by God, and he has come to take the speaker of the poem.
Yes.
And he says that he has crossed unknown seas. Death has come to him at his door, and the speaker says that my heart is fearful, yet I will take up my lamp of knowledge and wisdom, open my gates and bow down to him. He will look at death not as an enemy to be resisted, but somebody as a guest to be welcomed. He treats death as a messenger of God, and he worships death. Now this is very profound attitude to death which poet is expressing here, and he says that the messenger will come and do his job and go away, leaving a dark shadow on my mourning and my desolate home. Only my forlorn self will remain as my last offering to thee. So Gitanjali is a cycle of songs where poet seems to be offering various things. Anjali, as Anjali is the palm
tribute,
palm offering, and with every song he is offering one thing or the other. He is offering his ego, right? He is offering his mechanical thinking. He is offering his love for country. He is offering so many things, and final offering is his forlorn self, himself. That's the last offering which you give to your God, right? So this poem becomes a kind of summing up for us also, because it's death means the end, but at the same time it's the beginning of new relationship with God here, when he offers it as a final offering to divine's feet. So these are some of the important themes in Gitanjali.
Right. Can you tell me something about how in the present state of in the literary trends, how can we analyze Tagore? And how can we look at the translations? Yeah,
that's a very interesting question. In present time, when we are very far away from Tagore in terms of time and even culture.
I think you talked about the post-colonial reading. How can we do the post-colonial, or in different contexts, how can we look at Gitanjali?
Right. In post-colonial terms, we can look at how Orientalist construction of nation as a kind of spiritual, ancient, antiquated land seems to have influenced the intellectuals of that period. They are also in many ways they are adopting the same vision of nations which Orientalists, the Westerners who wrote about Indian culture are selling them. So in one way they are actually adopting the same vision of nation, which in post-colonial terms would be very elitist view of nation. They are looking at nation from upper caste, upper class perspective. And that's why 19th century intellectuals like Tagore were seen as in some way continuing the colonial project of the Westerners. Now this is a very harsh view, of course, but at the same time we should keep in mind that he's a very great influence on later development of not just Bengali poetry,
Yes.
but even Gujarati poetry, Marathi poetry, and other poetries of the subcontinent.
Even
So-
the influence is felt even today.
Even today. So that impact you can feel in contemporary Gujarati poetry also. So that's where his importance lies, that he opens up a tradition
Yes.
which is followed till this date, though it was very severely criticized by the later generation of
Right.
Bengali writers who were modernists in their views, and they thought that this vision of India or this vision of life is very idealistic and romantic, and it doesn't really match with the reality of our life today.
Right.
So that was what romanticist, modernist protested or critiqued Tagore about,
Correct.
and they called it Tagore syndrome.
Right.
Right, and this Tagore syndrome was what they were trying to get rid of. So best way to look at Tagore for me is to contextualize him, look
Right.
at him as a representative of that period and acknowledge the influence he had on the tradition.
Correct.
That would be a very sensible way of looking at Tagore for
Yeah,
me.
and we have time constraints, so
Yeah. So I hope, friends, that this discussion help you, and it will help you to read the Gitanjali on your own.
at least it will create some kind of
Some
interest.
kind of interest among you for reading the text, and it will also help you in your studies, we hope. So we would like to thank BISAG for giving both of us opportunity
Yes.
to
Thank
present
you
our
so much.
views, and we'd like to thank the audience for listening to us. So thank you.